Okay. So after all that, here we are. So let's go ahead and pick up where we left off. Right, we're talking about fibrous joints at the moment. Right, we talked about kind of the sutural ones. We talked about gomphoses. Now we're talking about the cartilaginous joints, right? So these are basically typified by some sort of cartilage. The most common that you see is chondroses, which has hyaline cartilage in them. Symphysis, which is usually fairly rare. You only really have two symphytic types of joints that you really commonly run into, but they have little fibrocartilage components to them. And so essentially what this is, this type of joint is a joint where you have two different bones that are articulated together with this piece of cartilage, right? So for instance, when you take a look at a synchondrosis, right, this is the hyaline cartilage one, oftentimes the most common example of this is like the ribs, right? So the ribs themselves stop short of the sternum, and it's the costal cartilage that makes the final connection to the actual sternum, right? So that's an example of a synchondrosis where you have the articulation of the ribs to the sternum basically being sort of patched together by this hyaline cartilage component. The same thing can also be true for your hip joint, the ball and socket joint, right? Because it's rimmed in cartilage, the actual head is actually connected to the bone by this like little layer of cartilages in there as well. Now the symphysis is also got cartilage, only in this case instead of hyaline cartilage, it's actually fibrous fiber cartilage. And one of the best examples is the pubic symphysis, right? And the pubic symphysis is essentially like this little fibrocartilage plug that basically separates the two apexes of your two pubic bones, which is there for a reason, right? Because if you didn't have that little fibrocartilage plug in there, every time you took a step, your two pubic bones would collide into each other. That'd be pretty painful, actually. So it's a good thing it's there. Yeah, right. I know you'd be like, I'm just not going to walk today. So that's kind of what that's there for. Also, your intervertebral discs are also kind of considered a type of symphysis as well, right? Because you have the articulation of your two actual disc bones by that little disc of fiber cartilage, right? So the actual vertebral bodies are basically articulated to each other through that little fiber cartilage disc. And so that's a type of symphysis as well when you're talking about joints. The articulation of one vertebra to another through this fiber cartilage disc. Now, the last of the types of joints that you run into is the synovials. And the synovials are probably these are the big sexies, if you will, right? Actually writing it down. Anyway, right, this is kind of like the marquee player, right? This is the one that everybody talks about. This is the one that like gets all the headlines. As a matter of fact, if I were to ask you, point to a joint on your body, the overwhelming majority of you would point to a synovial joint, right? So that's because those are the ones we injure. Those are the ones that are most movable. And so they are for the purpose of ambulation and articulation. And typically when we think about joints, we think about two bones that are held together that allows us to move, right? So that's kind of what we think about. So these tend to be associated with very mobile areas. And a lot of it is associated with our appendicular skeleton, right? So a lot of those fibrous joints are axial, in nature, sutures and things like that. And a lot of these synovial joints are appendicular. So they're associated with movement and ambulation. So the synovial joints, which is kind of like what we spend a lot of time looking at, because let's face it, you damage a synovial joint, orthopedists are going to be able to help you with that. You're just basically kind of stringing your bones together with rubber bands. The doctors can basically re-rig the rubber bands and at least keep you upright. You jack with a suture and you're probably kissing a coffin at that point, right? So there's a different scale of damage, right? You'd much rather damage your synovials than your fibrous, because you're probably not going to survive damage to your fibrous joints because they're not designed for that sort of thing. Okay. So typically speaking, when you take a look at the structure of the synovial joint, usually what we do is we look at the knee as kind of the poster boy, because in the knee, it's a common thing, right? So we injure it a lot. We're familiar with it, a lot of the knee injuries. But as a synovial joint, it has pretty much all the components of a synovial joint. There's a lot of moving parts in a basic synovial joint. Obviously, we've already talked about it. On the bones themselves, you've got your hyaline cartilage, right? So this is your articular cartilage that's covering the tips of the two articulating bones. We already saw this before, right, earlier in the chapter when we were looking at the epiphysis and the structure of the bone advancement, and eventually kind of takes up all of that cartilage except for that little strip on the tip, right? There's your which is your articular cartilage. That stays, that never calcifies, and never turns to bone, because that's there for your articulation purposes. It's designed to keep bone on bone grinding from happening. In addition to this, you also have your joint sort of surrounded or sealed into a joint cavity. And it's sealed into this joint cavity by a capsule. So you kind of have this little capsular structure. And of course, you have different pieces of this capsule. It's like a liner, right? Basically, this is kind of what this is like. But in your joint capsule, you have a couple of pieces to it. So you have your fibrous portion of your capsule. Of course, if it's fibrous, usually you're talking about connective tissue, right? That's what makes it fibrous usually. And so in this case, it's dense irregular, right? So that's that kind of structural loose fill type of connective tissue that you put in there. And this piece here is actually what's going to be continuous with that fibrous layer, the outer layer, the periosteum, right? So this example, like where you have this kind of weaving of one liner to another. So the periosteum that's surrounding the bone, when it comes to the joint, basically extends and sort of covers over the joint. And at that point, it becomes kind of like that fibrous layer of the capsule. So really, it's the fibrous capsule is kind of like the outer layer of the periosteum. It just kind of moves and sort of encompasses and surrounds and bottles up that joint area. That way, your entire joint system isn't exposed. It's all encapsulated, right? So it's kind of protected in that sense. And there's a reason why you want that, because within your joint capsule, you also have a fluid area. And so you got a lot of fluid in this capsule area, in this cavity, and that's fluid is created and secreted by your synovial membrane. So this basically is going to be the inside or the inner layer of the capsule. So does it sound familiar? A connective tissue outer layer, a cellular epithelial inner layer that secretes. It sounds very similar to what we talked about with the perichondrium and the periosteum. That's a really key thing, right? Because a lot of times in physiology, if you've already solved the wheel problem, you're wasting your time to try to reinvent the wheel. It's better to just adapt the wheel than to try to come up with something new. This is an example of an adaptation of a structure that we've already figured out, right? Which is the periosteum. In this case, all we do is we slightly modify it and sort of make it fit our specific needs. We need it now to be secretory. So these epithelial cells are going to start secreting a fluid, that synovial fluid, into the actual cavity area. And so this is in this particular area, you'll kind of have a couple of other things in there that you'll see. Obviously, you'll see some loose fill, the non-structural version, areolar connective tissue, kind of filling some things in. You'll see fat in there. because fat is actually incredibly helpful when it comes to filling stuff. But this is basically the structure, the capsular structure that you have. Now, the fluid itself is a combination of a lot of things, right? So basically you have polysaccharides in there. And so those are carbohydrates, right, of one sort or another. You've got proteins in there that are floating around there. You got fat that's in there. Hyaluronic acid, right, which is a lubricant. Also a component of ground substance. You're probably wondering where you heard that before. That's where you heard it. So the fluidy piece of your extracellular matrix. So that's what's in there. So the synovial fluid is this kind of almost syrupy, kind of viscous, slippery fluid that's heavy on lubricants. Matter of fact, whenever you have an extracellular matrix and you want it to be kind of slippery and lubricating, oftentimes what you'll do is you'll secrete polysaccharides, right? That's what these proteoglycans do, is they're glycans, so they're carbohydrate structures. So they kind of tend to be a little slippery and greasy. Think of things like polyethylene glycol, right? Or kind of the sweet carbohydrate of like a radiator fluid, right? So those are slippery. They're kind of slimy when you feel radiator fluid. It's kind of got a little sliminess to it. That's because it's a lubricant. Same thing's true here. So what you're doing now is you're doubling down on this. You're basically secreting two different lubricating, slimy types of textures. So you can see then the overall message here of the fluid is to create slipperiness. Lubricate, lubricate, lubricate. Now, it's important to understand that in this system, because you're kind of in that interzone between two bones, you don't have any blood vessels in there. So this is not a nerve set area. This is not a blood vessel. It's not vascular. And it's not very nerve rich, especially in the articular cartilage area. So typically all the nutrients are coming from where? They're either diffusing from nearby blood vessels or they're actually being loaded into the synovial fluid specifically. So not only do you have lubrication in the synovial fluid, but you also have nutrition in the synovial fluid. So basically you can imagine then this encapsulated connection between two bones, both of them tipped in articular cartilage, and then secreted and filling that space is this very lubricant rich fluid with lots of nutrients in it to sort of basically grease the sled, so to speak. Okay. So there's no nerves in the articular cartilage, but does that mean there's no nerves at all? Of course not, right? Because if you ever damage your knee, you know it hurts. So there's nerves in there somewhere, right? So an example of some of them, just not a lot. Yeah, it's actually kind of amazing just how relatively painless knee injuries can be. Like I mean, relative to it's relative, right? So, right. I mean, if you think about like, stressing out an ACL or something like that, I mean, yeah, does it hurt? Of course. But there's a lot of other leg injuries, broken bones, for instance, and things like that hurt a whole hell of a lot more. I mean, it's like screaming pain. Well, part of the reason is because this is a fairly nerve deficient area. Right? And it's kind of like one of those weird things, like where you hear about football players. It's like, oh yeah, I blew my ACL. I had like one functional ligament, but here I was still playing the game. And you're thinking, it's like, well, how are you still playing the game? I mean, how are you able to stay upright? Right? How are you not screaming in pain? Well, it's because it's a fairly nerve deficient area, relatively speaking. And if you mix that in with the adrenaline of the game, you probably don't even notice it at all. And we hear about a lot of that, right? Because you hear about skiers blowing their knee on the slopes, and instead of screaming all the way down, they're just kind of limping, right? They're just kind of limping down. They're like, oh yeah, that doesn't really hurt all that bad, but if I can't really bend this way because my knee just goes like that, right? And it's like, how does that not, like when you do that, how you're not screaming? It's because there's a lot of relatively speaking, the nerves, it's fairly deficient, especially in the pain sensation area, not in nerves in general, right? So the kinds of nerves that you see in there are positional nerves. So they're nerves that are designed to give you a sense of position and orientation. It's a different type of sensation than pain. It's related to proprioception. Go ahead, William. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Right, because you got the fluid there, and so when you release, and it's kind of weird that like the pain sensation in your knee is not normal, right? Because usually, like something like that, you would think, well, this should be a relief, right? If I take the fluid off my knee, that should be a relief, but it hurts. The same thing happened to me when I was like 33 coming down out of the mountains, when I realized that my connective tissue was going on me, right? It was my patellar ligaments right here that hurt because I was going downhill, putting constant pressure on my foot because I was breaking myself. But it wasn't hurting when I put the pressure on it, which was the stress on the ligament. It hurt when I took the pressure off of it, which was taking the pressure off of the ligament. So it was the release of that that actually hurt, not the actual implicate. So it was an odd sort of thing. So the pain situation around your knee is a little on the abnormal side, relatively speaking, especially around some of these joints. Part of it is what your body becomes conditioned to, right? So you have a certain amount of pressure associated with fluid on the knee, which is just basically a buildup of synovial fluid, usually due to irritation of the synovial membrane. And so you kind of get a certain amount of pressure, but the pressure feels different than the pain, right? So it's not like a pain like if you just cut yourself with a knife. It's like, oh my gosh, that hurt, right? It's a different kind of a sensation. It's more of a pressury sensation or a discomfort, if you will, type of a sensation. So when you basically remove that, what you're doing is you're kind of like pulling the rug out from underneath all those other nerves that have kind of become adapted to that feeling. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh my gosh, no, what am I doing now? Right. So it's like it's going back to normal, but for them, that feels like it's going to abnormal because they've kind of become acclimated to normal. It's kind of like conditioning your brain. Your brain gets used to a certain level of pain, and eventually it starts to subtract that pain out. Because it's like, oh, you know what? Your knee hurts. Guess what? I'm going to stop thinking about this because it's not going to stop hurting. So we got to think about other things. So then when you change the system, all of a sudden it disturbs your new equilibrium. And it's like, oh my gosh, something just changed there. That really hurts. Right. And so it's kind of like you kind of become dysfunctional. And then you get used to that dysfunction. And then when you go back to function, it feels like it's dysfunctional again. Right? It's kind of like to a dysfunctional person, function is dysfunctional. That makes sense? Sometimes, yeah. Right? Because the injury, a lot of times, when you kind of go through it, you have the benefit of like endorphins. So that kind of helps to sort of mute. It's kind of like, morphine, basically. It's like natural morphine. That kind of helps to mute the initial pain. But the healing process can, depending on what it involves, can actually cause a lot more pain because your body's basically trying to sort of like reset itself, and that can be a bit of a painful process. So here's our knee joint, right? So we kind of talked a little bit about some of the moving parts, but here's our knee joint. So here you can see you've got your articular cartilage here on each of the bones. And then you can see you got your capsule, your little capsular membrane there. On the outside, you got your fibrous component. On the inside is your synovial membrane. And that's going to be basically producing all the fluid, which is going to be bathing this entire joint cavity here. And then it's from this then that you kind of see the extension, in this case, of a tendon, which is going to go connect to a muscle. So you can see how everything's interconnected. It's all interconnected the same way. Through connective tissue. You're just weaving your collagenous fibers together and kind of connecting connective tissue to connective tissue. Okay. So it's that same common theme. Okay, there's a couple of other things, however, right? That's the thing you love about the knee. It doesn't just stop there. There's other things. So what are some of those other things? Well, let's take a look at it. So you have in some of your joints, not all of them, some synovial joints have fewer of these structures than others. The knee has pretty much all of them. But a larger synovial joint will actually have bursae in them. So these are basically little membranous pockets. And they're filled with synovial fluid. So basically they're like little water balloons. That's great. So we're having a balloon fight. Now, what do? What you do is you take these little sacks of fluid and you stick them into areas that are subject to high friction and chafing. This basically reduces chafing damage. So as you're moving your joint, or your tissues are all moving over each other, right? Your muscles are moving over your bones. And so if you don't pack in there some sort of protection, then every single time you move your knee, that muscle is going to scrape across the bone. And that's going to be like a chafing sensation. That's going to do damage to the muscle. So in order to protect that, you stick that little water balloon in there, and that basically keeps the muscle from chafing directly onto something else. So you're designed to basically kind of keep that in there. It's very similar to a situation like when you got a bad pair of shoes and it's scraping on the back of your heel. One thing you can do to eliminate that is to put like a little pad right there to kind of, right, to just basically stick that in there. And what that does is that's like a bursa. So it's basically keeping your heel from frictionally scraping across the shoe and creating pain. Okay, that's exactly the way a bursa works. Of course, bursitis then would be the inflammation of that membrane, which would then cause swelling because you would have excess fluid development that causes problems and pain, right? So this kind of helps you to sort of separate out your ligaments and tendons so that you're not getting a lot of chafing, especially over the highly mobile joints, right? Which is the reason why the knee joint is a perfect one, because it's probably one of the most mobile joints on your body. It's probably the one joint that's probably used the absolute most of any joint in your body. But you're not stopping there, right? So you've got other stuff in there as well. So you've also got articular discs. So these guys are like little pucks, if you will, that kind of inject themselves into this area. So you have a couple of, you don't have a lot of these, but you have some like temporomandibular, right? So in the mandible area, where you're kind of separating the muscles from the bone, sternoclavicular, acromioclavicular, right? So notice that's in your pectoral girdle. So that's kind of separating some of the musculature from chafing and scraping in their articulations. So you're trying to minimize some of that. In the knee, you have menisci, right? And menisci are sort of a similar sort of a thing. So these are basically just little fiber cartilaginous pads that your knee rests on. So as I'm standing right now, I'm not standing with femur resting on top of tibia. That's not what's happening. My meniscus, which are both intact, thankfully, that's inside there. So really, actually, what my femur is resting on is these two menisci, the lateral, the medial, and then those are resting on top of my tibia. So I've kind of got that little spongy fiber cartilage that I actually rest on. Whenever you take a step, that's what your tibia is resting on. So really, if you think about it, the one who's taken the most punishment over your lifetime of walking is your meniscus. But you don't want to screw up your meniscus, because then you will get femur on tibia, and that hurts. Okay, so, and then of course you have tendon sheaths, right, which are basically like a little synovial extension that sort of covers tendons, and that's to sort of eliminate that tendinous contact with the bone, right, to protect the tendon. It protects the tendon. Yes, here we are. Okay, here it is. You're like, oh, that was quick. So basically, here's your knee, right? So let's take a look at it. So first of all, notice first of all that you've got basically a bunch of connective tissue wrapped around your knee, right? So even over your patella, there is a sheet of connective tissue that wraps over that and holds that patella in place. So it's not just floating around, but these are all sheaths that are connecting, in some cases, your muscles. And in other cases, it's kind of connecting or intended to connect and be more of a connection to your bones itself, right? So you can see just from your rectus femoris, you can see your rectus femoris is actually tendinally, it's actually reaching over your knee and it's actually connecting to your tibia. So the ligament or the tendon for your rectus femoris is wrapping over the top of your knee and connecting right at the top of your tibia. That's the reason why if you feel the little soft spot in your knee, you kind of can feel that little sheet of connective tissue going over that. That's kind of what that little soft spot is, because there's a little, that's that little depression area. That's that little gap, that cavity right there that you're feeling. But that's also covered, that little sheet. It doesn't feel like you're poking into a hole. It feels like there's something covering it. That covering is this tendon structure associated with the rectus femoris that's wrapping around it. So, but let's go ahead and cut it away, shall we? So let's take a look and cut those away and just take a look at the actual knee joint itself. So in the knee itself, you're going to see there's going to be a lot of ligaments associated with this. And a lot of these we recognize because of sports injuries, right? So let's take a look here. First of all, the ACL, right? The ACL, the anterior cruciate ligament, is basically connecting the tibia to the femur, and you can kind of see it going up and in, and it kind of disappears back there. But that's the ACL, the anterior cruciate ligament. That's on the front side, anterior side, and that's a connector between the femur and the tibia. Now, just behind the ACL, kind of like a pair of scissors, right? The ACL is on the superficial side, and behind the ACL is going to be the posterior cruciate ligament, also a connector of femur to the tibia. So what you have is this like little twist, this kind of like little overlay, where you have on the front side the anterior cruciate ligament, and then on the back side you have the posterior cruciate ligament, like that. Both of them connecting the tip or the head of the tibia to the bottom of the femur. So you're actually connecting those two together with those ligaments. And then of course, underneath that, so that's in between. So underneath that, you have your meniscus. So you have your lateral meniscus here. So there's a little pad right there, and your medial meniscus right there. So the ACL and the PCL are in between the two menisci. Of course, your meniscus isn't just sitting there, right? It's connected to everything. So what's connecting the two menisci together is this little transverse ligament that connects the medial to the lateral. So your meniscus is actually an anchored system. So they're not just free floating, they're actually tethered and anchored down so they don't move around. They're just sitting there. So that's the common thing. Now, there's a couple of others that I want to mention because sometimes you run into them. On the medial side, you notice you have on the outer area connecting the lateral condyle to the medial condyle to the medial condyle of the tibia. You have this guy right here, which is the medial collateral ligament, or the MCL. So that's connecting the two condyles, femur to tibia. And then on the lateral side, you have the same thing. So you have your lateral condyle of your tibia, and it has a lateral collateral ligament, LCL, that connects it down. In this case, it's grabbing onto the head of the fibula. So what you have then in your knee, ligament-wise, is you have the little pretzel twist, ACL, PCL, right in the middle. You have your two meniscus discs on either side, connected by the transverse. And then on either side of it, you've got the MCL and the LCL connecting your femur to your tibia on the outside. So when somebody, like for instance in sports, usually a quarterback, when they damage their MCL, notice you hear that one from time to time, don't you? Oh yeah, Tom Brady, that's the one he actually had injured. When he got injured, it was his MCL. And you never hear of anybody injuring their ACL. It's like, oh, this quarterback injured his LCL. It's like,
That's what I'm looking at right
right, the lateral, it's like, no,
How do
we've
you
never heard
fix
of that
that, though?
before.
Like,
What?
say I tore my ACL, like how would I?
So the ACL is the one in the middle. So that's usually, that could be like a lot of different torsional strains. A lot of times running backs injure that one because what they're doing is they stop and they have to cut and pivot. And when they do that, like if their foot cuts and pivots, they've got, you know, a 310-pound defensive tackle on their back. So they got force on them as well. And so if that foot doesn't let go, the ligament will.
If you tear it, like how would you like cure it?
It depends on what the tear is. If you're just an average Joe average who just blew it through skiing, it could repair itself just with rest. It depends on how bad it is. If you're an athlete, you're talking about a career choice and millions of dollars are on the line, literally, then you're looking at surgery. So they have to go in there and actually surgically repair it so you can get into recovery mode quickly. But generally speaking, yeah, it's problematic, right? But when you take a look at like an injury like a quarterback, it's never the LCL that they damage. This one here, it's always the medial one, right? The MCL. Why? Well, because what happens is typically when a quarterback is throwing, this is what happened with Tom Brady. If you actually go back and look at the footage of that, he was planting his foot, right? Because he's right-handed and he was getting ready to throw. But what happened was the defensive lineman hit him from the lateral side to try to tackle him. But what happens is if your knee buckles, your lateral slackens. No problem there. But what happens is as your knee buckles, it starts to pull your MCL apart. And that's where it frays and gets damaged. And that's what happened.
A lot of those in gymnastics, like this little girl that hurt herself and was hopping off her.
Yeah.
On both sides, I guess, the way she landed.
Yeah, and that's kind of, gymnastics is weird, right? Because you got a lot of weird torsional movements in there that aren't normal at all. Yeah, that's unfortunate too, because she was like, yeah, again, like with football, which is, you almost never hear LCL. But yeah, with gymnastics, because you're doing all kinds of weird complex movements, you could get all kinds of things. Skiers, generally, it's an ACL. So, and the part of the problem with skiing is obviously if you take a tumble, you're all interconnected. So it's like, that's one of the reasons why I'm not a big skier, because my idea of like, okay, so if I'm going down face first, then and I don't want to be connected to a bunch of clumsy skis on my feet that are basically going to ensure that I'm going to be a trash wagon by the time I get down the bottom of the hill. No, thank you. Right. So I've never really. Yeah. Well, see, that's why my dead body will be sliding sideways when coming down the hill. That would be my luck. Okay, let's turn it around, shall we? So notice on the backside, you have a similar situation, right? So you've got all these sheets of tendons and ligaments in this particular case that are kind of wrapping your knee. So your knee is like almost a wrapped mummy. I mean, there's a ton of connective tissue going on around your knee. Now, if we peel all that stuff off and take a look at the back, what do we see? Okay, so now we turn it around, right? So medial is over here now. Your lateral meniscus is over here. In the backside now, for the first time, you can actually see something you couldn't see from the front, which is your posterior meniscofemoral, which is basically a connecting ligament from the meniscus to the femur. Okay, so now that's another connection in the femur. So you got three of them already, right? You got PCL, ACL, and now you've got PML. And then of course your posterior cruciate ligament, your PCL, is going to be reaching down and grabbing on to the backside of your tibia. And so you can see then that you have several different looks. So you can see your friend here, here's your anterior cruciate ligament there as it goes in the front, and your PCL coming down as it goes in the back. So you're kind of seeing the backside of the twist now, what you're doing. So instead of looking at it like this, you're looking at it like this. Okay. So basically what you got is a bunch of connective tissue rubber bands holding your two bones together. And you've wrapped it in these big sheets of ligaments and tendons and muscles. And that's what stabilizes your knee. Denise, is that a question? Yeah.
It's connected some kind of way, brings through.
So it's like any other ligament, right? So the periosteum of the bone basically interweaves with the ligament. So the ligaments, instead of being just, it looks like you just kind of take a blunt end cutted rope and you glue it to a wall. That's not the way it works, right? So the ligaments basically are, because they've got collagenous fibers, and that's what they're made out of. And the periosteum is collagenous in nature, and they've also got those perforating anchoring fibers as well. All that gets woven together. So really, if you look at it, the periosteum of the bone, once it weaves with the ligament, it becomes almost like a unified system. So really, when you actually, quote unquote, tear a ligament, you don't really tear it usually. It's very rare for you to actually pull it off of the bone. Right? Usually what happens is there's some sort of a stress or a fraying somewhere else. And that usually can get laid down again, which is the reason why most of these ligament injuries can heal in time if you just stay off of it, right? The only reason why you always hear about surgery, something like that, is because usually we hear about these in context of like football players, and they can't wait for the natural healing process to kick in because they've got a career to save. So they usually try to fast track it, and they want to make sure that they can get this to the point where they can cut and pivot again, because otherwise nobody's going to give them another contract, right? So for just Joe Average, just whoever falls off the ski slopes, I mean, as long as they're just like normally just walking around and just doing daily things, they're probably fine. They could probably walk on that knee, depending on how bad it is. Yeah, you just literally weave it together. Yep. I don't know how often that happens, but that would definitely be the worst case scenario. Well, no, I mean, you're not necessarily, it depends on what you're looking at, right? I mean, obviously if it's your knee, you're not paralyzed because you got a whole bunch of other rubber bands in there holding your knee together. So oftentimes what'll happen is you'll strain it. And what'll happen is one particular movement of the knee will be a little weird, right? Like for instance, I've seen skiers where they've kind of blown parts of their knee. Everything is fine unless they try to buckle, and then their knee just kind of like bends like that because that's the ligament that's compromised now. So it's like one particular aspect of the range of motion gets compromised. If it's a full detachment, then you're probably looking at surgery to go in there and replace it because that's not going to heal. It's got to get back in there. So you're probably looking at something a little more significant. It's not going to paralyze you unless it's like a major one. Like for instance, your Achilles. If your Achilles completely detaches from your calcaneus, then you're probably crawling for a living. Right? Think the movie Hostel. Right? Love that scene. You what? Cut their Achilles. Well, that won't really kill them, but it'll slow them down so you can kill them. I mean, that'll definitely be a good thing. That'll be your advantage. Yeah. Yeah. So we'll just keep that in mind, Jamie. So let's say, okay, if you go after the heels, you know, I know you're trying to kill me. Right? It's like, yeah, right. Yeah, but I mean, that's, well, because think about it, right? Because what do oftentimes, especially predatory mammals, what do they always naturally instinctually go after? they go after the heels, the ankles, right? It's not because there's a lot of meat down there. There's not, right? The two places they go after is neck, because they know that's a kill shot, right? Or the ankles, because they know that if they can injure that Achilles, well, they don't know this actually. This is what instinct is telling them, right? But if they can compromise that Achilles, then they know they can take their time, right? It's like, I haven't killed you yet, but now you're limping. So now I can slow it all down and we can take our time and you're mine, right? It's just a matter of time at this point. So when that cute little dog is nipping at your heels,
It wants to kill you.
it's trying to kill you.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, just saying, Moose, I know you never nip at heels because you're too big to get down to those heels. But so this is kind of what it looks like. This is actually a real knee. So you can see, here's your ACL and there's your PCL back there. And you can see how your meniscus separates the two of them. And when you turn it to the side, you actually see a couple of other things. And this is kind of why I like the side view, because it kind of shows you a few other things. So first of all, you can kind of see the cavity. It's not a giant cavity, but it's there, right? That's associated with this synovial fluid. But then there's a couple of other things going on in there. Notice up here, you have a suprapatellar bursa. So you're sticking this one right in between the rectus femoris tendon and the femur, right? So that is to keep your rectus femoris tendon from scraping on your femur and causing a lot of pain. You also have one that is right underneath the knee itself, just right on top of the patella. That's like when you bend your knee, it's not creating a lot of overlying chafing on those upper tissues on your patella, right? Because your knee can get kind of tight, can it? So if you don't have something there to protect those overlying tissues, you're going to start to feel that in that upper skin. The other thing you also have liked about this one is you kind of stick in there these fat pads. These are also designed to give you some padding and some protection. So they're not quite the same texture as a bursa. They're a little stiffer, a little more structurally sound. But this is a fat pad. So like when you're underneath there, pushing on your little soft spot in there, you're pushing through the patellar ligament. This is the one that was hurting. You potentially might feel that infrapatellar bursa, which is right in that area. And then underneath that is going to be the fat pad. And then you get to the cavity. So that's kind of what's all going on in there, in that area. So if you notice, it feels kind of hard if you're flexing, right, your leg. But if you just kind of let your leg hang, it feels really soft in there. Well, what's causing that? What's causing that is the ligament, right? And the tendons that are wrapping over there. So as you're contracting your muscles, you're holding it's basically pulling the entire system tight, which is what you're feeling. You're feeling that connective tissue. When you let it go, why does your knee pop? Why does anything pop, right? So popping and cracking, especially around synovial joints, typically has more to do with pressure and pressure release than with anything mechanical. Yeah, so like a knuckle cracker, they're like, what caused you cracking? It's a buildup of pressure in there. And so when you basically bend your fingers back, what it does is it basically releases the pressure, comes out as a popping sound. And that's oftentimes the reason why cracking your knuckles kind of it feels good. It's because you feel that buildup of pressure. You didn't know it's uncomfortable, but then when you crack your knuckles, you're like, oh, that feels really good, right? So that's kind of where all that popping is coming from. Because there's fluid. It's fluid that's encapsulated in a cavity. So it's a pressurized system. So if it builds up, it's going to build up pressure. So moving it around so you can release that pressure allows that extra pressure of the fluid to sort of escape and to kind of reduce the pressure back down to a little bit more normal levels.
Is it bad to like crack your? It's a little too much
No.
Like my feet.
Yeah, I grew up. My mom was saying, "You're going to be arthritic if you keep cracking your knuckles." I'm like, I'm going to be arthritic if I don't, because I'm going to have so much pressure in my synovial joints. It's going to be like this. So none of that, but it has nothing. Arthritis is caused by the degradation of connective tissue in your joints. And none of that, but it's typically caused by your articular cartilage on articular cartilage. So like, for instance, if your meniscus begins to wear away and degrade over time, usually because you're getting older, then what happens is your articular cartilage starts to clap on the articular cartilage of your other bone. And that is what causes the pain. That's what the pain of arthritis is. It's when the two articular cartilages are starting to come in contact with each other because of the degradation of bone. It has nothing to do with synovial fluid buildup. Yeah. So keep cracking, right? Because otherwise, if that caused arthritis, then you would expect the entire field of chiropractic to basically be annihilated. Because what you would essentially be doing is fostering and hurling people toward arthritis. And that's not the case. Okay, so let's take a look at the synovial joints. So if these are the poster boys of the joints world, then what kinds of synovial joints are there? Well, there's a lot of different types, right? And we can sort of organize those and sort of classify those in a couple of different ways. So shape-wise, you have basically plane-like, saddle-like, hinge, pivots, ball and sockets, ellipsoid, whatever that means, right? So the different types, these are mostly like shapes of the actual joints themselves. But you can also categorize them by movement, right? So for instance, a uniaxial joint will only move across one axis. A biaxial will actually move across two axes, usually right angles of each other. Saddle joint is a good example of that. And a multi-axial is when you have different axes. So not just two, but multiple different directions that you can move. A good example of that one would be a ball and socket. Okay, so there's two different ways you can look at this. Let's take a look, first of all, at the plane and saddle joints. So a plane is basically a type of joint where you essentially have one joint sort of sliding across another. So the articulation basically is sort of like this. So you're kind of like sliding across each other like that. That's a plane joint. Typically speaking, a good example of that would be like your vertebral discs, right? Because they're basically two planes that kind of slide across each other. Now they don't do that a lot, right? But in very small amounts, they're kind of like sliding kind of back and forth like that across each other. So that's an example of a good plane joint. So those are all planes. Now the saddle is a little bit different, right? So a saddle basically is where two bones come together, and they tend to be biaxial in nature, usually, not always. But they come together like this, and then they're like a coupling, right? And then they can move either this way or this way. So it's kind of biaxial that way. And a good example of that one is like the thumb, right? The thumb is kind of a saddle type of a joint. So it kind of moves in two. I mean, you can kind of rotate it around a little bit. So it's a little freer than your usual biaxial, but it's kind of got, dominant movement. So it can move this way really, really well, and this way really, really well. The others are just kind of like extensions of that. So this is an example of a saddle joint, and it's pretty good. It's a pretty good joint. But you don't really see it a whole lot of places in the body. Then you have the hinge, right? This is the most obvious one. This is the easiest one. And of course, the elbow, that's our poster boy. The knee, right? These are all hinge joints. They tend to be uniaxial. They're in one direction. So basically it's a hinge. Flex, extend, flex, extend. That's it. That's it, right? So knee, not hip, knee, right? Flex, extend, flex, extend. So that's basically a hinge joint. You're only moving in that direction. Notice what your knee is not designed to do. It's not designed to move in this direction or this direction, right? When you do that, that's when you're compromising all those ligaments in it. That's when you're blowing your ACL, you're damaging your MCL, those sorts of things, right? You're not supposed to move in those directions because it's a hinge joint. You're exceeding the capacity and the range of motion of your hinge joints. What about a pivot? So a pivot basically is where you kind of have
it's kind of like it's a pivot system, right? So you have to have kind of like a circular sort of articulation. Now, generally speaking, you don't have a circular bone. It's usually an articulation. Like for instance, in this particular case with the radial ulnar, is because you remember you had that whole osseous membrane. So the radius and the ulna are really wrapped together really tightly with their joint. So one of the things with the radial head that you have, because if you recall, the radial head is in the radial notch on the ulna, it's actually fairly shallow, right? I mean, if you look at that, you're looking at this thing, they're like, how can you actually put these together and keep them together? I mean, you got to do something better than that. So they don't really they don't just snap together like Legos, like some do, like for instance, the acetabulum and the head of the femur, right? Always, yeah. Right? I mean, it almost looks like a little Lego system, right? You just got to pop that head the head of the femur and the acetabulum. It's almost like a Lego set, right? But when you take a look at this, it's like, well, yeah, there's a little radial notch there, but it's really shallow. So how do you keep that in there? Well, you have to wrap it with this ligamentous wrap of connective tissue, and that creates the circularity that you need. So then the head of the radius fits inside that little wrapping. And then what you do is you pivot. So basically when you pivot, you're inside the hole and you're basically rotating around. That's what gives you your pivot. That's the reason why when you turn your arm, when you pronate your arm, your radius on your ulna cross over. In order to do that, your radius has to pivot, right? And that's where this pivoting joint comes into play. Ball and socket, right? Who doesn't love a good ball and socket? And the ellipsoids, so much for that. But anyway, right, so the ball and sockets are really cool because like the femur and the acetabulum, you just basically stick a big ball in the vinegar bowl and you just rotate it around, right? And so you obviously have the pectoral girdle is a good example of one, right? The glenohumeral and the hip, of course. So these guys are probably the most movable, right? They're multi-axial. You can go in different directions. However, there are some limitations, aren't there? We know this. Why? Because you can't do a 360-degree windup with your leg and throw a 95-mile-an-hour fastball. But you can with your arm, right? So you can see both are ball and socket joints, but both are very differentially wired to give you very different movements, right? You're trying to visualize what it's like to throw a baseball with the leg, right? Yeah, it's either way, it doesn't work. Yeah. So what about the ellipsoids? So the ellipsoids are kind of like the plane ones, only they're kind of more elliptical in nature, and they're kind of a little bit more shallow. Like a good example is, and the only one that I can really think of is the atlanto-occipital. That's the technical name for it. But remember those little superior articular facets, right? And the little articular condyles in the skull, where it sits down in the atlas, right there. And it kind of like, one was like the shallowing, the facets were the shallow area, and they were perfectly designed and hollowed out for that, for the articular condyle, right? And so that's an example of an ellipsoid. So where you kind of have like a little oval shaped shallowing designed to fit a little oval shaped swelling on one side. And so it's very similar in nature to a plane, only it's very particular in terms of the way it's actually organized. Okay. So those are the types of bones. What about your types of movements? Well, let's take a look at it. So we have plane joints, right? So plane joints, basically, they don't move a lot. They're not designed to move a lot. And so they do like what's called gliding, right? Think about our example of plane joints was the vertebra, right? And your vertebrae don't move a lot. They're designed to move a little bit. So each individual vertebra just glides along the other one, but it does it just a very little bit. So how does your entire vertebral column get so much massive movement? How can I go like this and like this and like this and like this, right? Get so much movement. It's not because of any one, it's because of the accumulation of all, right? So it's not just one vertebra sliding or gliding across the other. It's the top one gliding a little bit, the second one a little bit more, third one a little bit more, fourth one a little bit more, the fifth one a little bit more. So if I accumulate all those slides between all those vertebrae, then I can actually get a very long and a very dramatic movement. Okay, it's the accumulation of all the movements of all the vertebrae that then sums up to the overall gross movement of the entire spinal column together. Okay, so that's how we get so much flexibility out of our spine. So then there's what's called angular movement, and this is simple, right? I mean, just like angular movement, all this means is your angle changes. That's it, right? So what does that mean? So that means the angle between your bones, right? So for instance, if you have a bone that's articulated to another bone, this is the advanced Scooby-Doo version. So if you're changing that angle, then that's an angular movement. That's basically all that means. Okay. So we ran into this, didn't we? Right? We've already talked about some of these, like flexion and extension, right? So basically, when you're looking at flexion, you're making that angle more acute. Extension, you're making it more obtuse. And then we saw that across the body. So we have extension and flexion of the leg, of the head, of the arm. We have plantar flexion and dorsiflexion, right, which is pointing your toes versus pointing your toes upward. We also have abduction and adduction. If you recall, abduction means to go what? To abduct somebody means to take them away, right? So an abduction is moving away from the body. Adduction is moving toward the body. That's the midline. And then, of course, you've got circular types of movement. Angulars or flexion, extension, abduction, adduction. Circular types of movement are things like rotation, supination, circumduction, things like that. And then, of course, they kind of don't fit into any of the major categories. So here's what you're looking at circular. What I also like to do is I like to kind of put some of these together because some of these make some sense. I mean, obviously pronation and supination we know about, right? Pronation, supination, right? Rotation though, what is that? And how is that different? Right, because if I just did this to Joe Average, they'd say, oh, that's rotation. But no, that's pronation. So what's rotation? So rotation is basically simply turning around a long axis. It's like spinning. This is the end of your bone. It's like spinning like this. It's actually rotation. So when you take a look then at circumduction, this is basically like drawing a circle in the air. So let me explain to you what this looks like. I'm going to do rotation with my arm. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate this around. And notice what I didn't do. The wrist is not moving. Now I'm going to do circumduction. So circumduction is like drawing a circle in the air. Okay. Now, if I want to combine a couple of techniques, I can do circumduction and I can add pronation to it. Pronation is different because with pronation, what I'm doing is I'm turning the hand over, right? So notice with circumduction, I'm not turning the hand over. It's staying put. So this is circumduction without pronation. When I rotate it, watch the hand. This is rotation of the arm without pronation of the wrist. I'm not moving the wrist. Now, what happens if I add the two together? Circumduction with pronation. Now I've got a complex rotation. What did I just do? Curveball, right? Or the swim move. So when you're doing the swim move, you're noticing, and the reason why I'm doing this, because you're talking about the movement of your pectoral girdle, which has a lot of complexity to it, right? So your swim move is a combination of circumduction, going around like this, at the shoulder, rotation of the shoulder, plus pronation, rotation of the wrist. So your swim move is that, which also happens to be a good pitch, a finesse pitch. So if you're a fastball pitcher, then right. Or if you're me pitch, actually, a little more. But anyway, right. So that's kind of what we talk about. So you can see then that rotation, the circular movements, can be quite complex. Now you can't do that with your hip joint, can you? I mean, all you can do with your hip joint is you can kind of do this sort of thing. You can do some good dance moves with it. I mean, but you know, you're not really, I mean, you can kind of get out here a little bit. You can kind of, but you, I mean, what really are you doing with this? I mean, honestly, I mean, is there a reason to do this at all? I mean, unless you're dancing away from the lion, right? You're kind of like, you know, kind of dance away from the lion, that sort of thing. That was an image you probably didn't need to see. But anyway, right. I mean, so it's not as useful down here, right, as it is up here. Because we're very ambulatory up here. We're doing a lot of stuff up here. And so we get lots of movement. But if you take a look at the actual joint construction of your hip versus your shoulder, which are both ball and sockets, they're very different, right? Okay, so that's a good place to stop. We'll finish up with chapter 8 probably next time, and we'll get a good start on muscle physiology. We'll probably spend a little bit of time in that chapter. Yep. No, chapter 7 is just an anatomy chapter. You can get into it if you want. It'll complement lab, typically.
What is it?
And Bree, you have an exam.
Oh,
Turn it, right?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. How much?